The year was 1899, and the West wasn't the same wild frontier it used to be. Lawmen and agencies were pushing hard to civilize the land, building railroads, towns, and schools. But not everyone agreed that taming the West was progress. Someone, or perhaps several someones, was leaving a bloody message. A serial killer, or killers, tore through the territory, leaving a trail of dismembered corpses as their signature. I was an agent for the state, worn thin by the hunt. The killings weren't just brutal, they were designed to mock us, the law, and everything we stood for. Every victim was left ripped apart, their remains scattered, as if to make us waste more time piecing them back together. The message was clear: the law doesn't belong here. Weeks of dead ends had brought me and the other agents to the brink of madness. Factions formed within our ranks, blaming each other or the government for trying to tame the untamable. Then Belle Wilson's name came up, a notorious outlaw who ran with a misfit gang known for robberies and shootouts, but oddly avoided unnecessary bloodshed. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and I suggested we find him. If anyone knew the hidden trails and backwaters where this killer could hide, it was him. It took days to track Wilson's gang to their hideout, a dilapidated cabin deep in the canyons. When we rode up, rifles poked out of every crevice, and their revolvers gleamed in the fading light. I raised my hands. "Easy there. We're here to talk, not fight," I called out, my voice steady despite my racing heart. Belle Wilson stepped out, his broad frame silhouetted against the dying sun. He looked like every dime novel outlaw you'd ever read about, but his eyes carried a calculating sharpness that told me he was no fool. "You got about 5 seconds to explain why I shouldn't have my boys fill you full of lead," Wilson said. "We have a proposition," I said. "You help us stop this killer, help us clean this mess up, and we'll give you a break. No more manhunts, no more deputies chasing you down. You help us, and we'll make sure you get left alone." Wilson's lips curled into a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "So the law's coming? To the outlaws for help. Hell of a thing. All right, agent. You've got my attention." That night, we pored over maps by lantern light, marking the locations of each killing. The pattern wasn't random. It formed a loose perimeter around an area of dense forest near the canyons. "They ain't working alone," Wilson said, his finger tracing the map. "Too many hits in too many places too fast. This is a group, not just one man." The next evening, we rode out. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made every sound in the dark seem like it could be the last thing you heard. The moonlight barely filtered through the trees, casting jagged shadows on the ground. Then we saw it, a figure in a clearing, standing still as stone. At first we thought it was a scarecrow, but as we drew closer, we realized it was a man. His body was covered in cuts, his clothes soaked in blood. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there like some kind of offering. One of Wilson's men nudged his horse forward, uneasy. "What the hell is this?" Then we saw him. On the hill above us stood a man in a black, tattered coat. His head was bald in the center, with long, scraggly gray hair framing his face like a grim halo. He raised his arm, holding a revolver, and fired 3 shots into the air. From all around us, wild men emerged from the shadows, brandishing knives, axes, and makeshift clubs. They charged with guttural screams, their eyes wide with madness. The fight was chaos. Gunfire lit the night, and the air filled with the clash of metal and the sickening sound of blades meeting flesh. The killers fought like animals, seemingly impervious to pain. We managed to drive them back, but not without cost. Several of us lay wounded, some barely clinging to life. Amid the carnage, I saw one of our youngest agents, Thomas, sprinting after the man in the black coat. I shouted for him to stop, but it was too late. By the time I caught up, the man had stabbed Thomas repeatedly, his knife flashing in the moonlight. "No!" I yelled, drawing my revolver, but Thomas was already on the ground, lifeless. Bell Wilson appeared beside me, his twin revolvers blazing. The man in the black coat turned, his face twisted into a feral grin, but Bell didn't hesitate. He fired until the man's body was riddled with holes and collapsed into the dirt. We stood there, breathing hard, blood soaking the ground around us. The remaining wild men fled into the darkness, their leader dead. Bell looked at me, his face grim. "This ain't over," he said. "Not by a damn sight. Whatever this is, it's deeper than just one gang of lunatics." He was right. As dawn broke, the horrors of the night is living within our souls. The West had always been a place of violence, but this was something darker, and it wasn't finished with us yet. The train rattled beneath my boots as I sat across from Elias Thorne, a man chained hand and foot. The desert sun slashed through the grimy window, casting bars of light across his weathered face. He smirked like the devil himself, his dark eyes glinting with something that made me uneasy. "Marshal Reeves," he said, dragging out my title like a mockery. "Tell me, how does it feel escorting a man to his death for a crime he didn't commit?" I clenched my jaw, staring at him through the narrow brim of my hat. "You're a killer, Thorne. A gunslinger with a bloody reputation. The law's caught up to you, and it's about time you faced justice." He laughed, low and slow, like he had all the time in the world. "Justice, that's what you call it. Sending a man to the gallows because he looks like someone who might have done something bad. What proof do you have? What real proof?" I didn't respond. His words hit harder than I cared to admit. "You ever wonder," he continued, leaning forward as much as his chains allowed, "how many innocent men swing because they fit the part, because the law doesn't want to look deeper? It's easier to close a case than find the truth. You tell me, Marshal, when's the last time anyone asked you to think for yourself?" My hands balled into fists, but I forced myself to keep still. Around us, the train car's other passengers had started to take notice. A miner, his face smeared with coal dust, shot me a glance. A woman clutching a baby whispered something to her husband. "I don't need to think for myself," I snapped. "I enforce the law. That's my job." Thorne smiled, leaning back. "That's your problem. You're so busy enforcing rules, you don't see how blind they've made you. Take a look around this train. Go ahead. Tell me which one of these folks could be a killer." Against my better judgment, I did. My eyes swept the car, landing on a wiry man in overalls with soot on his hands, then on a family huddled together near the back. The father had a strong jaw and hard eyes, someone who looked capable of violence. Thorne watched me like a cat studying a mouse. "That one, huh? Looks the part, doesn't he? But he's just a father trying to keep his family fed. And me? I look the part, too. But appearances, Marshal, are a dangerous thing to trust." The train jolted, and a ripple of unease ran through the passengers. I could feel their eyes on me now, some of them murmuring to each other. "You know about the woman they say I killed, right?" Thorne asked, his voice quieter now. I nodded, wary. "Did they tell you she was pregnant?" The words hit me like a blow to the chest. My throat tightened, but I managed to keep my expression steady. "What difference does it make? Murder's murder." "Oh, it makes a hell of a difference," Thorne said, his voice darkening, "because the story they told you isn't the truth. I didn't kill her, Marshal, but I know who did, and the real killer. They're still out there, free as a bird, because your lawmen needed a scapegoat. I shook my head, trying to block out his words. "You're just trying to get in my head." "Am I?" He leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Or maybe I'm just telling you what you already know. Maybe the law isn't as clean as you'd like to believe. Maybe they're using you, Marshall. You're a good man, maybe too good. The perfect kind of man to manipulate." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Around us, the other passengers had grown restless, their whispers turning into murmurs of debate. "Marshall," a voice called out. It was the miner. "If what he's saying is true, don't that make you just as guilty? You're taking him to hang without knowing for sure if he did it." "Quiet," I barked, my hand resting on my holster. "This isn't your concern." But it was too late. The car had turned into a courtroom, the passengers arguing back and forth about guilt, innocence, and justice. Thorne leaned back with a satisfied smirk, watching the chaos he'd sown. When we finally reached our destination, the sun was low on the horizon, casting the train station in an eerie orange glow. A pair of government agents waited on the platform, their faces shadowed under wide-brimmed hats. As I unshackled Thorne from his seat, he looked up at me, his expression strangely somber. "Marshall," he said, his voice softer than before. "Don't trust anyone. Not them, not your superiors, not even the ones who say they're on your side. The West may be getting tamed, but the people, they're just as wild as ever, and sometimes the law is worse than the outlaws." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My moral compass felt split right down the middle, torn between duty and doubt. As the agents led Thorne away, I stood on the platform, watching him disappear into the crowd. His words echoed in my mind, louder than the train's whistle. And for the first time in my career, I wasn't sure if I was doing the right thing. Deadwood Pass had its share of legends, but none shone brighter or darker than Sheriff Nora Blake. At 28, she was the first woman to wear the badge in the rugged mining town, a symbol of law and order in a place that once thrived on chaos. She kept her head high, her Colt steady, and her past locked away where no one could find it. But the past doesn't stay buried, not when it's dripping in blood and bound in promises. Nora had built her reputation on brains and resolve, the same qualities that once made her the most dangerous mind in Jedediah Hazard's gang. Her plans had emptied bank vaults and derailed trains. She'd loved Jedediah once, with all the reckless fervor of youth. But when the bodies piled too high and her soul felt too heavy, she walked away. Becoming sheriff was her penance, a way to redeem herself for every dollar stolen, every life ruined. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Nora sat in her modest home, a book in hand. She savored the silence, the kind that only came after a long day keeping the peace. But when she glanced out the window, her heart stopped. A horse stood in the yard, a chestnut with a white blaze down its nose. It was the same breed she'd ridden back in the gang. She went outside cautiously, her hand on her revolver. The horse snorted softly, pawing the ground. It wasn't hers, but it felt like a ghost from another life. She hitched it to the post and scanned the area, but no one appeared. The next morning, a package awaited her on the front step. Inside, nestled in rough cloth, was her ghost revolver, the custom piece Jedediah had gifted her. The pearl handle gleamed in the morning light, as pristine as the day he'd placed it in her hand. Her chest tightened. Someone from the gang had found her. For days, Nora moved through town like a shadow, watching every face, every movement. The miners, the merchants, the drifters, all were suspects. Her badge might have made her the law, but it also made her a target. That evening, as she rode home, a chill settled over her. The sight that greeted her stole her breath. A black horse hitched outside her house. She knew that horse. She knew him. Inside, he was waiting. Jedediah Hazard sat in her dining room as if he owned it, the flickering lamplight casting shadows across his face. Time had changed him. A beard now framed his jaw, and his hair hung longer, but his charm hadn't faded. He wore black and gold, polished boots, and a devil-may-care grin. "Nora," he drawled, his voice smooth as ever. "It's been too long." She stayed by the door, her hand hovering near her holster. "Jed." He leaned back in the chair, appraising her. "You look good. Different. A badge suits you. Almost makes me forget who you really are." "I'm not her anymore," she said evenly. His smile thinned. "Oh, I know. But you made me a promise, Nora. Remember?" Her heart sank. "I promised a lot of things, Jed. Promises I never should have made." His eyes darkened, the playfulness vanishing. "You said you'd marry me. You said you'd stay." She tightened her grip on the doorframe. "I also said I'd never go back to that life. I meant it." For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Then Jedediah stood, towering over her with a presence that once made her knees weak. "You're breaking my heart, darling," he said softly, pulling his revolver. Her breath hitched, but she didn't move. "Upstairs," he ordered, the barrel pointing at her chest. Nora walked to the bedroom, her mind racing. Jed followed close behind, his boots echoing against the wooden floorboards. "Open the wardrobe," he commanded. Inside, shoved to the back, was her old gang uniform, dark pants, a white shirt, and a crimson bandana. He grinned. "Put it on," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Nora hesitated, but she knew better than to defy him. As she began to change, she noticed his gaze lingering on her, his breathing shallow. His gun lowered slightly, his attention elsewhere. It was the opening she needed. In a blur, she reached for her ghost revolver hidden beneath the mattress. Before Jed could react, she fired. The shot echoed through the house and Jed staggered back, his eyes wide with shock. Blood seeped through his black shirt as he slumped against the wall, sliding to the floor. For a long moment, Nora stood frozen, the gun still in her hand. Her heart pounded as she stared at the man she once loved, now crumpled and lifeless. She lowered the revolver, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The weight of her past lifted, replaced by a crushing emptiness. Nora sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. She'd killed before, but this felt different. Jedediah Hazard had been a part of her, a ghost she'd carried for years. Now, he was gone. As dawn broke over Deadwood Pass, Nora holstered her gun and stepped outside. The black horse remained, pawing the ground. She untied it, watching as it galloped into the distance. She turned back to her house, steeling herself. The past might be dead, but its scars would remain. And as the first rays of sunlight painted the town, Sheriff Nora Blake resolved to keep moving forward, one step at a time.